Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of what I'm calling the UMG for VR Ultimate series, where we cover as much UMG stuff related to VR as we possibly can. So in this video, we're going to cover how to make a interactive light switch, which uses event dispatchers to turn off and on lights. So I'm going to show you how we can actually use Photoshop to build our own UMG images. So we go to VR template, textures, UMG's door, switch. We've got some UMG elements that we created in Photoshop. I'm going to show you how to do that, and then how to put them together inside of a UMG widget, which we can then have set up to be interactive doors, like on-off buttons, which switch and show status. Rather than showing the graph, just straight up jump in, and I'll show you what we're going to do. So you can see our light switch against the wall. When we get close to it, we can only select our off button because the lights are already on. So if we press off, we turn the lights off and we change the status. We've also got the text that changes on the top, and then we can switch between. So we're going to look at how we can do that and how to do it clean and effectively, especially with event dispatchers inside of our lights. So if we have a look at our light blueprints, you can see we've got that set up. So we can actually have as many of these in the scene as we want, and all they have to do is listen to our light switch. So grab a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or an energy drink, and let's get started. So at the end of the last series, or in the end of the last video, I should say, we finished up with interacting with our button that we had placed in the world. So we created a UMG blueprint, which we could place and drag and drop around our level. And then when we jumped into VR, we had our pointer set up so we could interact with stuff. And then when we got close to buttons and we pointed at them, so it did it on that one. And that is because there's something here that we're interacting with, which we'll look at now. But we can press this one, and we can see that it actually interacts. But we can't actually press the first one that we had in our scene. And the reason for that is technically our new blueprint is overlapping or in front of this one on the left. And you might be thinking like, oh, we'll just move it back, move it forward, but that's just going to move the problem to another one. But what you can see is if we have a look and we move this around, I don't know if it shows up on the recording, there's a very faint outline around our button. And what this is our widget canvas. And what that's doing is overlapping our other stuff. So when you place a UMG in the scene, especially if you're doing it like this and you've got a global blueprint you can just drag and drop into the level, then you want to go to widget, and you can see here we've got something called draw size just underneath our widget class. And what that is the size of our canvas. But our canvas is only our button. So what we can do is, because we're using 1920 as a reference and we don't have our canvas scaled down, we can actually drag this down on the X and Y, and you'll see eventually it clips our button. So we do it a little bit bigger than what our button is. So let's say 480, just so it's even. And then we can do that on the Y as well. We'll see that eventually it clips through. So we bring it up just slightly. So we'll do 250. And now if I move this blueprint, we don't actually see our yellow line or outline because it's so small. I think we got it pretty close to our blueprint. So if we do the same thing, so we've got 480 and 250 with this button, 480, 50. Oh, no, 250. Now if we jump in, we should actually be able to interact with both of these buttons, even though they're right next to each other. So we got the one on the right, and then we got the one on the left. So you can see now we've actually got left and then right. So this is one of those things that it takes quite a while to figure out, especially if you've never used UMG before. So what you want to do is make sure that this, or your widget, matches your draw, or your draw size matches the size of your actual widget that's in there. If I was to take this and I change our widget class back to the health and safety one, you'll see that we just get the information box. That's because our X and Y is actually cutting out everything else. So it's kind of clipping the UMG itself. So that's just something to keep in mind when working with UMGs as well, especially when you've got them in the scene and placed around, because you don't want these overlapping and blocking different things. It'll just cause you a lot of trouble later on down the line. So now we can actually interact with our buttons in our level. I thought what we'd do is we can actually jump over to Photoshop and I can show you how we can make some buttons or UMG textures that we can bring into our Unreal project. And what I'm thinking of doing is making a light switch, a bit like what's in Cyberpunk. I'll see if I can find one, be right back. So something like this, where we've got a on button at the top and then an off button at the bottom with maybe a title or a name at the top that we can change. So this is actually going to look at the designing something for UMG and what you can do for that, and then blueprint communication with UMG so we can actually make it open a door or we can make it turn off a light, and then we'll have a look at that and see where we get. So let's jump over to Photoshop. So I've opened Photoshop and I'm going to make a canvas of 1920 by 1080. This is just so I've got a reference in my head to work with when working with UMG as it all lines up. Resolution 300 might be a bit too high, you can probably lower that down, but my background is going to be transparent, so we're just going to hit create. Once Photoshop's loaded up, I will bring it over onto this monitor. And now we can actually start designing our UMG. So we're just going to make a new layer. And obviously you can do this in any photo editing software you've got. GIMP, I think there's Photoshop, GIMP. You can even probably do it in Substance Designer. I think there's another one, Picasso, I think. I don't know if that's one, but I can't exactly remember. So we're just going to use Photoshop for now because that's what I feel most comfortable with. And I actually find setting my background color to a light gray actually helps, just so I can break stuff apart. And there's a couple of things to think of when doing your UMG design or your UX UI design, and that is colors. So one excellent thing to do with your UMG is to personalize it for your project. But in some cases, you might not know what you want early on. And this is specifically, or works better for sci-fi stuff. And what you can do is you can build everything in white. And what that allows you to do in Unreal is actually modify the colors at runtime so we can update and change them. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build my button or my door controller completely white as each part of separate layers. And then we can bring them into Unreal and we can construct that in our UMG and then choose the colors that we want, because I want to cover UMG materials later on and how we can make those emissive and glow if you're working on desktop VR or just desktop projects in general. Bloom doesn't work very well on mobile devices without mobile HDR, so it doesn't often look as good, but you can still use it if you need to. So let's get started. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is actually use the pen tool. Actually, no, what I'll do is I'll use the rectangle tool, and then we can actually just draw a rectangle like so. I think that'll be a good size. And I'm going to position this in the center, if I can find it. It doesn't seem to want to do it, so let's just drop it anywhere. Doesn't really matter. And in this case, because I've clicked off, I'm going to switch to graphics and web, and then that allows me to select our layer and modify the properties panel here. So I'm going to change our line thickness to about 10. That's going to work as our border, so it'll be a layer on top. We then need another layer, and I'm going to try and do this in order, where I'll just duplicate that one. We'll duplicate it down, and then we'll set this to a white fill. So we won't actually be able to see them, so we'll do background, and I'm going to do this T underscore door button underscore background. You might need to be aware of naming conventions if you need it, but we can actually copy and paste that and spell button right. Spell button. Control C. T underscore door border. So we can't see it, but we do have a background and a border now. And now we can actually look at making our little UI elements. So in Cyberpunk, they have the floor title, and that's in a little box that goes at the top. So on the screen it says garage, but what I want to do is make a little... So to draw the inside of our design, what I'm going to do is actually enable grid. So on Control @ symbol, on UK keyboards at least, you can enable the grid. If your grid is not the right size for the canvas, you can actually go to Edit, Preferences, and then, where is it? Guides, Grids, and Slice. That opens up this window here. And you can actually do grid lines every 256 pixels, or 512, or 128. And I kind of going to put it to 128, just so it snaps properly. And what that allows us to do is actually snap our pen tool just to the grid, and then we can use this as a way to get this to line up properly. So I'm holding shift on the keyboard when I place points, and that allows it to go in a straight line. And then I can actually go through and I can make this the right size. So there. And now when I hit enter, it actually closes up and we've got our first box. And I'm going to do the same thing 2 more times. But the next one is going to be a little bit bigger. And we do need to have our point here. Like so. And I was going to duplicate this down, but we've got the bottom. Actually, that'd be a good thing to show you. So if we duplicate this layer and we drag it down out to the grid, we want to actually remove this point. So we can actually select our pen tool, hold Control down, and when you click on it, you'll see you get the points back. Once you've selected a point, it'll turn blue. So if I zoom in, and then you can actually just hit delete, and it'll actually delete those points. So now we can connect these up like so. And we have our bottom part, and then we'll just add another box on the bottom to be something else. So now we've got our title box, we've got an open button, a close button, and then just a random bit on the bottom. So now we have our rough design laid out. What we want to do is actually name our layers again. So we'll have this T_door bottom. Pretty confusing to name these, but what we could actually do is join the bottom one and the top one together so we can merge these. Let's just do merge shapes. I'll keep it like so. Awesome, we'll hide ones that we've already done. And then, so the on and then off, or actually we'll have it up and down. No. Yeah, we'll have it on the top and then off at the bottom. So let's copy and paste that. Button off. And this is important to do because we're going to make a couple of variations of these buttons just so we can have actually control over them. For example, if we jump into Unreal and we open up our widgets, we can actually customize this button. So we've got a button in our canvas, and on the right here, we've got a couple of options. So it might look like this by default, but in style, you'll see that we've got 4 different types of buttons that we can have. We have normal, which is the default one that we see. We've got hovered, so when we're pointing at it, what does it look like? And then pressed, so that'll be a quick one. So it could be removing a shadow behind the button so it looks like it's sank back in, or disabled, so what happens if the button's off, which in our case, it would be the opposite to whichever one has been activated. Or more accurately, once we press a button, it would then be disabled, so the other one was pressed on and then it would flick back. So that's what we're going to do. So we need a normal, a hovered, pressed, and a disabled. And I'm going to move my windows over to the right so I can keep this on there as a reference. And we're going to make a new folder. As it is, you can do this any way you want. This is just the easiest way that I find to do it. Make sure all of these layers are turned on so we can just hide the folder instead. And then we're going to make a folder for the on button and a folder for the off button. Excellent. If both these designs were the same, we wouldn't actually have to do it twice. We could just do it the once. But because they are different, we're going to have to do this for both of them. So what I'm going to do is select our button on, and I'm going to do an underscore. And it's going to be underscore N for normal. Then if we make another one, it'll be hovered. P for pressed. And then D for disabled. This just allows us to keep an eye on which ones we've got, and we can work with those as we go through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the other buttons. And I realize I've got these in the wrong folders. So let's just drag those down. Drag this guy up. Button on. And because off's going to be on the bottom. So you might be wondering where we're going to put our text. That's actually going to go into the center of this grid, or our buttons. But I'm not actually going to do it in Photoshop this time. I want to do it in Unreal Engine just to show you how you can do it later on, just so we can cover as much as possible. But if you are doing UI and UMG, it's best to put your custom fonts into Photoshop and then type them into whatever it is you're using, because that way you'll get the sharper image and the quality, and you don't have to have something else you've got to worry about or think about while you're building your UMG. It saves a lot of time as well. So because I want the border to be an actual different color to my main button, I'm actually going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call this door button off border. I think that's what I had previously, and then I got rid of it. So we're going to keep that like so. And we're actually going to go through and fill these in so we've got solid colors. What I'm going to do now is actually go through and add in our new stuff. So for our T door button off, which would be the default version, it's going to be a solid color. So I'm going to go back to our pen and I set our fill to white. Don't forget we've already got the border, so we don't need to worry about that. And what I'm going to do is actually going to right click. Actually, no, I won't. I'll go to the FX in the very bottom of the screen. Super difficult to see. Let me move this over for you guys. Make sure you can all see it. Yep, we can go to the FX in the bottom. And we're actually going to add a drop shadow. So let's find it. The very bottom one. So drop shadow. And rather than it going up, I would like it to be kind of in all directions, if we can do that. Yeah, like so. Size can be pretty small. Only has to be subtle. If I disable the grid, well, we'll do, okay, so we'll do 20 on the spread, hit enter, and then disable the grid. So now that's going to be our default button. And then for our pressed, it's going to be normal. So it actually going to, so we remove the border, it's actually going to drop down. So we want to edit our dropped button and then put a solid color on there as well. So pressed, it drops back, and then we'll use Unreal to change the color of it to a red. Hovered, we also want this to be a solid color because we're going to have it so it's a slightly different color red. And we can also do, yeah, we'll leave it hovered. So actually our pressed, so our door button and our pressed, if I have them not below the camera, can be the same one. So I could actually delete that. And I've just realized I've already messed up. So it's not disabled, it's pressed. So we'll set this one to disabled. Hovered is going to do nothing. We'll actually have that change color in the engine. So if we're hovering over it, we still need that drop shadow. So that could actually be our pressed as well. So I changed this around. So our T door button off normal has our drop shadow because it is up, away from the back. The T door button off disabled is also going to have the drop shadow. So we can just add that. And it keeps the same settings. So we're good. There we go. We could actually use the same one for the normal, which would work pretty well. So we can have normal and disabled be the same. So I'm going to delete that. That's one less texture we have to worry about. Hovered, that's going to be the same as normal, except it will be a different color. So that could actually be the same one, but we're just going to change the color in Unreal. And then pressed is where it's going to have no drop shadow. So it goes to default with the infill as white. So we've got a border, the normal, and then the off, and then we're actually going to repurpose these to work how we want it. So now our T button on, that is also going to be a border. So we want to do underscore border, duplicate in the same folder, and we do the same thing. We have normal, which has a drop shadow. I'm just using the bottom right here. Accent drop shadow and fill. It's going to be white. And then we want pressed to actually have no shadows. Excellent. So we've got both of our buttons. Let's go through our actual top parts. So off button, on button. It was a bit confusing, but we got there in the end. And we can see based on the layers, it actually looks pretty good. So it'll be hovered above. So when you press it, it'll look like it's sank back in. And I'm going to do the same thing for our top and bottom bit. So then we actually double select that, go and add a drop shadow to this. So I did that with just the border. I think it looks pretty good actually. That should stand out. It breaks it up so the buttons stand out from the border. And what I'm thinking of doing is seeing if we can do that with the border itself around it. So FX, drop shadow, and we'll see how this looks. Keep it like so, because that actually gives us a nice effect. I think, yeah, it looks a bit stylized. Once we've added some color to it, it'll look pretty good. So now that we have all of our layers done and we're happy with the output, so I actually went through and I relayered this so we could see the order of them, and I actually put the drop shadow on the background as well. So it just stands out a little bit more, especially when we put it against a wall. And with a mesh, we can make it look a little bit like it's 3D without having to do too much to it. So this is the fun part. What we can do is we can actually export this all out of Photoshop. And before we start, we want to select the background or set it to hidden. And then I'm going to select every layer like so. And then we can right click on one of these layers and we can do export as. So you can see here we get all the different types. Feel like it's missing something. So let's have a look. There we go. So I went through and I selected each one individually. And we can see we've got all the different parts, pressed and then not pressed, or normal and then pressed. I always think it's the other way around. So we've got our borders, both our buttons and our background. We want to set this to PNG. And we're actually going to keep the size and width as it is, and then that'll bring it to Unreal just fine. So we're going to go to export. We're going to find our folder. So I found the folder location for the project. You could actually go into your actual project, content, find a textures folder and then add it in there. But I recommend bringing it in separately so you don't have to worry about those file sizes. So we're going to right click and we'll do project content, and then we can make a new folder called UMG, and then in here we can have it as our door buttons, door button texture, black folders. And you'll see here, oh, it went a bit fast. It'll actually use the layer name as the export folder, export file. So if we open up Unreal now and then bring this back in, what I'm going to do is save Photoshop, save as. We're going to save to the same place, so we have everything in there. Project content, UMG, door buttons, door buttons. And this is because Photoshop plays up with my computer for some reason. Hits performance pretty hard. So if we close that, we can actually look at importing our textures that we just created for our UMG. Move this up. I want to find a textures folder. And I think we already have one in the template. Yep, we've got textures, icons. So I'm just going to make a new folder called UMG textures. So I want to keep these separate from default text. And we're going to do a new folder called door button. And we'll do door UMG. And now we've got this, we can actually right click, import, project content, UMG, door button, and we can select all of these files now and just drag and drop these in, or bring them in. And what we're going to do is we're going to right click and select all of them. And we're going to try and use batch export. So bulk edit via property matrix would be the best one to do. We're going to make sure all of them are selected. So select the top one and the bottom one with shift. We then want to go to compression, I believe it is, and level of detail. Yep. And for our compression settings, we want to set this to user interface. And then for our texture group, we want to set to UI. So we hit File, Save All. See the stars disappear, it means we've saved. And now we've got all of our UMG images with transparency. We could go through here and add in our UMG directly to this folder, but I'm going to keep it all organized. So I'm going to right click, going to create a new user interface, widget blueprint. Widget blueprint, let's go door button, just so we know what we're doing. And then we can actually start constructing our content. So the first thing we do is go to textures. And what we can do is we can actually drag in those images into our widget blueprint. So I'm going to move this over to the side a little bit. And what we want is to just take the background, the button, the door button border. So that'll be the whole border, and then the button bottom. And the rest of these should be our buttons themselves. So we're going to drag these into our canvas. Bit difficult to see there, but we've brought them in. And you see that's really small. What we want to do is size to content, and it'll get even smaller. But what you can do is you can actually go through these three images and set their image size back to default. And then that'll align them, or set their scale back to normal. And from there, we can select all three of these. Anchor points set to center of the screen. Set our alignment to 0.5 and 0.5. And then we set our offset left and offset right to 0. And then it aligns it up for us. So now we have our actual background and buttons. and compile and save. And we want to keep this organized as much as possible. So we're going to rename this to background border. It's not spelt wrong. To be fair, if I make one of these tutorials and something's not spelled wrong, something's going wrong. So we've got our top part, and then this is called door button bottom, so we'll just call this bottom. Excellent. So now we can actually look at how we can color code or edit the color of these to match what we want. So I like red, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tint here. So you see I've selected the layer. Can use tint, and then we can actually use this to color code and modify how our UMG looks. So I'm going to use a dark red for this. Borders, do the same thing. And for our background, we'd actually do, maybe let's go for a gray. So I actually settled on like a nice gray for this with a white. Just helps it stand out a little bit better. And if you want to save colors, you can actually open up the color palette or the color picker, and you can drag them from the new. So if you drag them up to this top bar here, it'll actually store it for you. So if you select another object and then you want to change the color, you can then select it there and it'll actually update for you. Let's go for this one. Make the borders in the center match. And now we can actually look at adding in our buttons. So the first thing we're going to do is take one button and going to set the anchor point to center, same as normal. This is the way I do it for all VR stuff. Just makes it much easier to work with. And then we can actually move this alignment up. And I'm also going to do size to content. So now what I can do is I can go to our normal, and because this is going to be our on button, I can actually search on button, and I'm pretty sure we should see it turn up here. So button on normal. This is the normal. So we have it like so. And then we can move it down. Then on hovered, we're actually going to have the same one placed in here. And we're going to tint it. So it's a, let's do an off orange. So we'll see it quite clearly. So once we hover over it, it's going to change color to a orange color. And we'll make it a, so when the normal's on, it'll be a light blue. Something about there. Just so we know it stands out against a red. So we've got our normal, our hovered. Pressed, we want to have our normal button. And the reason I'm adding it there is because I can just select pressed. And then we'll do this as maybe a green, just so it stands out. And then for our disabled, we want to default back to our normal. So default normal, that'll have our shadows. And we're going to set this to a dark red. Actually, we'll do triangle actual red. Bit more orange than the actual orange, so we can still see the difference. Disabled. And now we're going to do the same thing for our bottom button. So you see we've got button has been added. We're going to turn this to BTN for button underscore on underscore. Yeah, we'll just do button on. And then I'm actually going to duplicate this so it goes down. I'm going to rename it. And as long as it stays centered, we can just reposition this down. And then all I need to do is go through our buttons and then set them to the off normal, off normal, off pressed, and then disabled will be normal, like so. So we have our buttons all set up. So now that we have our buttons in place, what we're going to do is we're going to add some text. And we'll see that once we add our text onto them, it's actually going to change the scale of it. This is because our button is currently set to size to content. So it's taking into account the size of the text as well. We don't want this. We're going to keep it uniform. So in this case, for these two buttons, we're going to disable size to content. And we're going to manually set our size X and size Y. And you might not know what this is for your UMG. So what you can do is you can open up your button, find out which one it is in your image. And then if you hover over it, once it's actually been brought up, you'll see that it says dimensions 405 by 309. So we're going to put this 405 by 309. And you see it brings it in. And we're going to do the same thing for the bottom one, because as soon as we do that, it's actually going to shrink again. So we've got our button 405 by 309. So 405 by 309. If we were doing this procedurally, we would use a box, or whereabouts is it? Optimization. We will cover that in a little bit. With a horizontal box or a vertical box, and we could populate this as we go. I'm hoping to do a video solely on them later on, but it's going to be quite a lot to cover, so we'll have a look at those later. And we'll just cover this for now. So in this case, we're not actually going to do anything special. We're going to do, we're just going to change our text to say what it is we're doing. So in this case, it's going to be light on or off. So I'm just going to do on, and I'm going to set our scale to be, yeah, let's do 100. Works well. And then we're going to do the same thing for off. So 100 on scale. And we'll do this as off. And we actually have our alignment. By default, it's set to horizontal align center and vertical align center. These are all good, but you can see if we change these, we can get to position in different parts of our UMG. And you can do a couple of different things with it, so it works really well, but we're just going to keep these centered for now. So we got on and off. And I'm going to change the actual color of our font to black. So make sure I'm on the text. I think it'll stand out a little bit nicer against the other backdrop stuff. We can always change this later on. And then we're going to add some text on the top here. So we're going to take some more text, drag it across the top, anchor point to center, 0.5, 0.5 on alignment, 0, 0. We'll move it up. And then we can change the scale of this, size to content as well. We'll just call this lights. So this is our light switch. And I just realized what we could do is we can actually create a color. So we've got an image which turns on or off in the bottom here to indicate which one we press. So if it was on, we could set it to green, or if it was off, we could set it to red. So I might actually do that. It's a bit easier than changing the color of our buttons, even though we're still going to do that anyway. But we can actually make it a little bit nicer. From a distance, it might be easier to visualize as well. So let's bring in an image. And this allows us to actually cover layers and order of stuff in our UMG. So we're going to stretch this over the whole thing. Color, let's do default. The door will be green, so it'll be on. And if you use the Photoshop, layers work from top to bottom. So if it's at the bottom, it's actually further back down the stack. Whereas in Unreal, it's the other way around. So if it's at the bottom, it's technically on top. So you want to drag it up. So if we put it right at the top, it would then be behind the background. So it'd be no good. So we want that in front of the background. And then we've got it there, and we can actually drag this in and down so it just sits behind. So we'll keep it like so. So now we actually have our light switch, so we can hit compile and save. And I'm going to minimize this window for now, so we're going to go to our VR template. And rather than using one of these, because we're actually going to need to code this later on, we're going to create a brand new blueprint. So I'm going to go to UMG folder. So we'll do a blueprint class, actor, and then we'll call this BP underscore UMG door button. So it could be on off, or actually we'll call this on off switch. UMG on off switch. Put some underscores in so it's easier to read. And now we can actually drag in or add a widget component. Widget, compile. And I'm going to rename our door button widget just so it's easier. So rename on off switch, because we can reuse this all over the place. So now in our widget, we can select our on off switch like so. It comes in absolutely huge. And now is a point we can actually modify that draw size. So if we drag it in, it's difficult to see because we can't actually see it. If you know the size of your widget, you can actually use that. So let's just do 540, and then we'll drag it up to be just a bit higher than 1024, around there. And I actually scale these down in here rather than the editor. So I do about 0.2 by 0.2. And you'll see that we still keep our sharp lines and images. So we can go to file save. And now if we drag this into our level, let's put it over here. We've got some lights we can use. You see it faces the other way. So let's rotate this around. It's still absolutely huge. So we'll make this smaller, and I'll do it in the blueprint so we don't have to keep doing it everywhere else. So 0.05, 0.05, I'll save. So now we have our light switch, and our status bar isn't in the right location. So that's moved. Or did I remove it? Nope, it's in the right place. So what that makes me think is its anchor point is actually in the incorrect place. So if we select it, you see here the anchor point's in the top left. So that actually changes based on whereabouts our draw size is. So if I change the draw size, it's actually a good way to show how it actually works with the snapping or the anchor points. So you can see here, which is why it actually moves and why I set it to center. So it always stays in the same place. So as soon as we reposition this, and then 0.5, 0.5, we can then reposition that so it's exactly in the correct position. Save. And then it'll show up in the bottom here. Now we've got our button and our lights on. Bear in mind it's not going to do anything, but if we jump into Unreal now, and we're able to teleport around, we can see that we actually have our buttons on the wall, and nothing's happening, we're not pointing at it. So the reason for that is because I forgot to change the collision of our widget. So if we open up our blueprint, what we want to do is select our widget component, and then set UI to custom. Set everything to ignore, apart from the 3D widget, we want to set that to block. So now we hit compile and save. So now we fixed the anchor point for our color, made it center. It'll stay in the same place. And I also want to make sure its status color or its name has been updated so we know what we're working with. So now what we can do is actually press compile. And then if we jump in, we can make our way over to our UMG. And now when we point at it, you can see we can actually interact with our buttons. And if we click, we see it goes on and then off. But what we want to do is once we click it, we want it to be disabled. And then we can only press the other one. So once we press off, it would enable on. And we're going to look at that now. This is going to be really good because it's going to help us understand how to code blueprints or how we can use blueprints to code UMG. So we're going to open up our switch widget. We want the widget itself because this is where we're going to do a lot of our code. So first thing we do is make sure our status bar, where we select it, is a variable because we will want to access this to change the color of it as we go through. And by default, our buttons will already have their variable on, so we can work with that. So now we can go over to the graph. The graph is where you code your UMGs. So we've had a little look in here, and you can see I've already got a button, and we're going to delete these because I had a bit of an issue while recording this. So we're going to keep our pre-construct node. You will have a couple of others. You have on construct and then a tick, I believe, or we can, yeah, tick, I think it is by default. But what we want here is event pre-construct, which means we can see it update in the editor. And we're going to use that to set the status of these buttons from start. And then our status color. We want these to be able to be seen in our variables panel. So to interact with buttons and make UMG know that we're pressing them, we first need to select our button in our variable. So we'll do this in order. So I'll work with on. And when working in VR, you most likely want to use onClicked. It works much better than pressed or released because they just add a bit of a delay and it doesn't work very neatly. I don't know how to describe it. It just doesn't work very well. And it adds a little bit more complexity to this. You can use these for specific things. So you say on release, once the button's stopped being pressed, that it does something else. But in most cases, onClicked is pretty much what you want. And we'll do that for the off as well. So onClicked. And now we can get events. So once those buttons are pressed with our widgets, we actually fire something. So we could do a print string from our on. Let's do this as on, so we can see it. And then we're going to put this here as well for our off. So once we press these buttons, we've got a reference to work with. And what I'm trying to do in my head is figure out the order that I want these to happen in. So by default, the light in our scene, which we will then later on control, this one at the back here with the hidden and visible, actually hidden in game, maybe baked lighting, yep, movable. Should be able to turn this on and off once we build the lighting again. So we'll do that in a minute, but that's what we're going to control. And I'll show you how to do that. I'll set this back to default, so we'll cover it again later. And for now, we want to start with our off button as the enabled one, and our off button has been disabled. So to disable the button, first thing we're going to do is drag in the one we want to disable. In this case, it's our on button because it's going to be off by default, or it'll be on, so it will technically be disabled. So we're going to get our button on, and we want to actually drag off this and search is enabled. And you see we get three options, and the one that we want is set is enabled, and we'll plug this into our pre-construct. The tick is off, or the checkbox is unticked, so it'll be off, or it will be disabled. If we tick it, it'll be enabled. So we're going to hit compile and save. And if we have a look into our level and we press simulate, you'll see that it actually turns gray. And this is something that we can fix pretty easily, but I wanted to show you this now rather than fixing it earlier. There's not much info out there on how to fix that. And if you remember, we actually set a color for this. So once we disable it, it should actually change to an orange or a red. And to do that, what we want to do is go to our Widget Designer, and we want to select our button. So you can see, because we use pre-construct, it's actually gray in here as well because it's disabled. And we actually have our disabled set to use a red tint, which is clearly not what we're seeing. And what we want to do here is actually change our draw as to be an image. So currently it's set to none. If we set it to an image, you'll see that the color comes back. And we see that it updates here as well. We can actually go through and change all of these to be image. Be super useful to do. That's border and image. So now we'll see that it's updated. We've got our button images. We see the colors. If we hit compile, it actually updates. So now once we press play, our button is disabled and we can't interact with it. We can only interact with the off. So now it's time to set it up so it switches based on which one it is. So by default, the light will be on. So event pre-construct is going to be button on disabled. And then once we press on, actually, we'll keep that. Once we press off, we want to set our on button to be enabled. So we just copy that down with Control W and we tick it. And then we take our off button, now we duplicate this, and then we set it to be disabled. And we do the same thing with the top. So when button on is pressed, we enable our off button and we disable our on button. So now if we jump in, we go for a little walk around our scene, we can see that when we start, we have our on button is disabled by default. If we get close to it, we can point. So when we press off, it switches, and then we can go back to on. So we need to actually change our off button to also have those controls set to be image. So we select off, want to go through these, set them all to image, like so. And I think I forgot to do disabled, like so. Excellent. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to change the color of this part here, so our status color. So if we drag this in, we can do a get, and then we can actually set color. You see we've got set color and opacity. We're going to say when it's on, it will be green. And we'll just use this for now, so we won't actually set up any variables. Green. And when it's off, we're going to copy and paste this down, plug that into the off button, and we'll set this to red. About there. So now if we compile and save, we should actually see these change. Go off, goes to red, and then when we press on, it goes to green. Excellent. So now we can actually start using this to turn our light button off. So while recording and testing this, I came across a bug where if I dragged a point light into Unreal, it would crash because of pre-construct. So I've just changed that to event construct. It does the exact same thing, but it stops it. Stops my editor. I spoke too soon. Stops my editor from crashing, or at least I thought it did. So when it comes to interactions with widgets, I like to try and make it as modular as possible. And this can actually be quite a challenge in some cases, because if we have a look here, we've got our on-click and our on-click button off, but we're not actually doing anything. And we can't really get references to our blueprint, as this is where I want to do most of our work. So at the minute, we just have our widget inside of a widget component, and it's doing nothing. We want to say once we press our button, we want something to happen in our blueprint. This could be sending a message to another blueprint, or it could be another blueprint listening to this blueprint, the one that's been placed in the world. It's a little bit confusing. I have a video on widget interactions or widget communication a little bit more in depth, which I'll link, but we will be covering the same stuff here. What we want to do is we need to think about how we can send information from our widget to our blueprint that is our parent. Get owner or get parent doesn't work in this case. So we search get owner, we don't get anything, and then get parent just gets our widget parent. So what that means is it would just get our either a canvas panel, which is technically nothing, or one of these if it was a child. So that's not going to work. What we have to do is we have to get a reference to our blueprint somehow and then go back to it. So to do this, so what we're going to do is we're going to make an actor which references our blueprint. So in this case, it's a BP underscore UMG on off. This will be depending on your UMG itself. Actually, what we're going to do is this one's set to actor by default. We want to search BP underscore UMG on off switch and then object reference. So we're going to have this as parent light switch or parent switch, a little bit more logical. And then we're going to hit compile. And you'll notice down here that this reference is basically empty. So if we drag it in and we do a get, it's not going to do anything. But what this allows us to do is access information inside of one of these blueprints. And that's what we can use to turn this on and off. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click and create a custom event in here now. And we're going to do this activate. And then we'll have one as deactivate. That will do a custom event and then deactivate like so. I'm going to keep those ones there just in case we need them. I'm going to hit compile. Now we go back to our widget. We have this reference here. We should be able to drag off this and search activate. And you'll see here we actually get our core functions. So we've got activate and deactivate. For our on, we can plug it into activate. And then from here we can also do deactivate. And I think because I'm making this up as I go, I'm actually going to rename them to on and off. So rename on, deactivate, off, hit compile, and then we make sure it's changed here. Excellent. But the issue is now that this doesn't have a reference at all. So we need to set this. What we're going to do is go to our blueprint and we're going to drag in our widget and we're going to cast to it. So there's no easy way to do this without casting. But what we want to do is we want to get our widget and we want to get user widget object. And then we say on begin play, we want to cast to our widget blueprint on off switch. So our UMG, whichever is in our parent. And we want to set that variable that we created. So we want to set parent switch. So parent switch, set parent switch. And we're going to have this as self. Like so. And we hit compile. And while I'm here, what we're going to do is we're actually going to promote this blueprint to a variable. And then let's go to the widget component. Widget component. So we've got a reference to that if we ever need it again. I should plug that in there. And now what that means is once we press those buttons inside of our widget, it'll actually fire these events inside of our blueprint. So it's a bit of back and forth, but it allows us to do some cool stuff. So now we can control everything from our widget inside of our blueprint. So if I do this and I do print string, and we do actor on, so we know it's this one, and then we'll do actor off. And we know our widget works, so I'm going to remove the print strings from here, so we know they're not going to be displayed as well. So now when we press play and we test it again, we should only see our actor on and actor off print strings fire. I'll save. I'm going to do save all because I'm having some crashes. You see here doing it on the headset, so I'll be right back. And now I'm back. If we jump in, we can actually go over to our button and we should be able to see that say actor on and actor off. And now we can actually use our blueprints to control our environment. So we got on off and it works exactly how it should do. So we see them print strings. And now we can actually have this light switch communicate to something else. So we've got our actor. So all we have to do is hook these up to control some other blueprints and actors. And we need to figure out the easiest way to do that. If you haven't seen my video on casting casting, blueprint interfaces, and then event dispatchers, I recommend checking those out after this video. But I'm thinking with this one, we're going to use event dispatchers because that will allow the lights just to listen to the actual light switch. So we don't have to go in and select every single one of them. And we can also have this switch do some other stuff as well. So I'm actually going to use event dispatchers specifically because I want my lights to listen to the switch rather than my switch communicate to all of the lights. What that means is we don't have to have a variable or an array list just stacked with different actors. We can just have each one of our actors in the level, so our lights, listen to our switch and then fire. It's just cleaner and it's easier to use. So the first thing we need to do is actually come into our BP UMG on off switch and we're going to create two event dispatchers. First one's going to be on switch, or we'll do switch on, and then we'll have switch off. Excellent. Super simple. And all we're going to do is call these. So switch on, we're just going to drag in and call. And then switch off, we're going to drag in and call from our switch off. So basically, once our button is pressed in our UMG, it fires our event dispatcher. And then whatever's listening to this or listening to this blueprint will hear these fire. So that means we can actually set up a light blueprint. It's not going to work for a light in the scene like this. It does have to be in a blueprint. So we're going to right click, blueprint class, actor, BP underscore light. And then we can have it as so, and we're going to double click this. We'll go to add component and we're going to add a point light. I'm going to change my settings here to 2000 for intensity and attenuation radius. I'm just going to set this to 300. So it's a bit smaller than default. We'll hit compile and then we can go over to our event graph. And this is where we're going to listen to our light switch. So the first thing we need to do is create a variable. And this is going to be our light switch that we're listening to. So it'll have to be light switch. And the type, or the variable type itself, will be BP underscore UMG on off switch. And then we can have object reference. And we are going to make this public because we're going to select it in the scene. Hit compile. And now we can actually drag this in as a reference. So we're going to get. So we're going to get that as a reference. And then we're going to use event begin play. And what this is going to do is just activate our bind, so it just listens when the game starts. It doesn't actually run until it hears it, but it'll just listen out in the background for it. And we're going to make sure we hit compile first, so it updates our reference. But what we can do now is we can drag off this, and we can search for our switch on, and then switch off. So we're going to drag off. Now, what we want to do is search switch on, and you'll see that we get this brownish color variable here, and we want to actually assign switch on. When we do that, it creates a event for us, our custom event, and we do switch on, and we can plug this into our event begin play. And we're actually going to keep this neat, so we'll drag in another get light switch, and we'll do get switch off. Actually, we'll just do switch off. Well, get is a different thing, so bind event to switch off. I keep getting it wrong. It's assign event to switch off. Switch off, and then we'll connect these like so. And now we can actually tell the light what to do with these. So if we drag in a point light, we can get, and then we can search set hidden. Set visibility doesn't actually do anything. So we will set that to hidden. So when we switch on, we want our light to be visible, which means this box stays unticked. We're not hiding it. But when we switch off, we're actually going to set it to hidden. So we do the same thing. Get our point light. Set hidden in game, and we say it will be hidden. So now what we can do is we can actually compile and save all, and we can drag in some of our lights into our level, and I'll connect this one up to this light switch here. So we just select the dropper and we select the light switch. So now this light is listening to this switch. We can drag in a couple of these like so. And what we could do is we could even put another one on the other side of the door to control it as well if we wanted to. But in this case, we don't want them to go all funky, so we'll actually drag in another light along here, and then we'll change this reference to be this light switch. So now once we press play and we jump in, we can see that our lights are on by default. If we set our lights to off, we turn our lights at the back of the room off, and then we turn them back on. If we go over to this one, we should turn those lights off, and then we can turn them back on. Exactly like that. So this got me thinking, what if we wanted to change the lights so it does something else? Or we say on the right one, it could say back lights, and then on the left, it could say right lights. Let's have a look at doing that. So we're going to go straight over to our BP UMG on off switch, and then we're going to select our widget because we want to actually open this one up. So we'll open up our switch widget, and what we do is we're going to make sure light is set to is variable. And what that allows us to do, like we said before, it'll allow us to access this. So we need to rename this something. So txt underscore, let's do switch, excellent. And now we can go to our graph, say on construct, we're going to get our switch text. We're going to set the text, so set text brackets text, and we're going to promote this one to a variable. So this pin here, so we just right click promote to variable, and then switch name. We're going to keep that like so. So if we hit compile, by default we'll call this light switch, or we'll just call this switch. And now what we can do is we can actually go to our light, or our blueprint, which contains our widget actually. Bring these up, and on event begin play, we've got our light switch. We want to set, and if we scroll up, you see we get set switch name. So we can bring this along, do that to there. And now if we actually promote this one to a variable, keep it as switch name, hit compile, and then we make this public. What it means is we can jump into our level, we can select our lights, and you see we've got switch name. We can call this back lights, and then side lights. And now once we hit compile and play, you can see that actually updates the text, and we can activate those lights and choose what to do with it. So we overcomplicated the design of the blueprints, but that was to show the buttons themselves and how you could actually have different states and different colors. So we created our textures. So let's have a look in our template, textures, UMG. We created these, and they're all white, so we can actually control the color of them, which we put together inside of our widget blueprint. And then we went through and changed all the color of our text. Oh, we didn't change the color of our text, we did for the buttons, but we added in our images and we aligned them. We used anchors, and then we actually hooked those up to our blueprints. So we got our button inputs. So if we select our button, off on, we got our on clicked. We set the is enabled, so we could enable and disable buttons as we wished, and how we could actually change those so they didn't appear gray by setting our draw as to image. We then set the color of our bottom switch so we could see what state the switch was in, just to show how we could actually change the information for different things. And then we went as far as turning on or off the switch inside of a parent blueprint. And we did that by creating a reference to our light switch, so our blueprint, which contained our widget. And then inside of there, we cast to our widget and we set it as self. So we said, okay, widget, you're in this blueprint, you're listening to me. essentially, which is what's happening here. And then we set the name for the switch, and then we had the on-off. We then created some bind events or event dispatches, so we could call if the switch was on or switch was off. And what that allowed us to do was have our light look for the light switch rather than our light switch look for our light, which saved us a load of variable information and inputs, and actually allowed us to turn our lights on or off as we wished, or as we wish. So it would be expandable. So now we can actually go in, we can add as many lights as we want. So we go to recent placed, BP light. We can actually have these go around, do something silly. And then all we have to do is tell this light to, okay, listen to this switch. So even though we did a basic light switch setup, we covered quite a bit, but I'm really hoping that you guys have been able to figure out that you could use this stuff to do a lot more complex things. For example, you could have the buttons activate QuickTime events. You could have them turn things on or off like computers, activate explosions. You could have the explosions listen to an actor. It doesn't have to be a light switch. You could use the event dispatchers to have things listen to other things, and just a whole lot of complex stuff that we can use to expand our projects. So if we end with it, we can go up to our widgets. We can turn this one on or off. So it turns the inside on and off. And then this one, we actually have it change the inside wall. And then we turn it back on, we get our lights on the outside as well. So I mentioned earlier on that I wanted to cover materials, especially widget materials as well. So we're actually going to look into that now, and then we'll probably wrap up. So if we select our widget, we want to go to widget, and you can see here we get a element 0 material. It's called widget 3D pass through underscore masked underscore one-sided. What we want to do is set a little magnifying glass. So we find our engine content and then engine materials. And what we actually want to do is create a new one of these. So we're going to double click this, which is the easiest way, then hit the magnifying glass for parent. That'll go back to opaque. We're going to hit that one and do the magnifying glass. So we finally get to widget 3D pass through. And what that allows us to do is actually open this up, and you can see that this is a parent material, or at least a master material. Then what we're going to do is we're actually going to copy this. So drag it over to our UMG folder, and we're going to copy it there. So UMG, I'm going to right click, rename m_widget pass through. This is going to be our custom widget material. So what we do is we can drag this on, and you see that nothing changes. However, our bounding is outside of that, so we're going to fix this now, like we said earlier on. And then with that done, we can actually open up this pass-through material so we can modify it. And you'll see once we open this up that it's actually not too complicated, but we have got a couple of things here. And one of the specific things that I want to show you how to add is a power node. And the reason you might want to do that is because by default, this actually looks pretty good in the editor. But what you might not realize is it's actually quite washed out based on the light that interacts with it. So if we add a point light, I'm not doing it now, but if you bake the lighting, it can be quite washed out. But if we take a power node, so power, and we plug it into multiply, and we'll keep it as ×2, and then hit apply. So we've got our multiply, going to our emissive, we've added a power node with default power 2. You'll see that actually goes almost black or dark. So specifically the background. And this allows us to actually have more control over how this looks. So 1 is default, and then you could do 1.5 and apply that, and you can see that just adding that little bit extra changes the color of our widget quite a bit. And this can help you narrow down your design style and stop it from interacting with the world so much. So that's just something that I like to do. You could also add a post-process node if you really wanted to. So volumes, if you were doing desktop, let's say we add a post-process volume. We'll do intensity. We'll ramp this up quite a bit for our bloom. We'll keep it on standard. think that's good for this. And you can see it actually starts to glow now. So based on what you're after, you can actually use this as a way to get there. So let's have a little play around. And we'll see that if we select our power node while we have our post-process volume in there, and we change this, so we ramp it up, let's say we set this to 3, and then apply, you'll see that it actually starts to just add color to the main areas. So it's a bit like a post-process effect. So we add too much, it disappears. So that was 50, it was meant to go to 5. And you can see as you work on it, you can get a variety of effects. But by default, power node should be set to 0.3. Because without the post-process volume, it looks all right. If you are using a post-process volume and you don't want it to glow, just set that to 1, and that'll set it back to default. And what you could do is actually add a multiplier after our power node. So we plug our power node into our top A multiplier, our multiplier into our emissive. And now if we set our power node to around 3, we'll see that goes really dark. But if we up our multiplier, let's say to 3 as well, and apply, we start to just bring out the emissive on those buttons. So it's a bit of a play around. You can actually promote these to a variable or to a parameter, like so. We'll set the exponent default to 1, and then promote to a variable, and we'll call this emissive multiplier. And we'll have this set to 1. So you see it goes back to being default. And then what that means now is if we hit apply and save, we can close this window down and we can create a material instance from our material. So we'll call this MI widget pass-through. And we can apply this to our widget. So we can actually open this up and we can play around with this in real time to try and get an idea of what it is we want to achieve. So this is a more play around type of situation. So you can see it's like from a distance it glows really bright, but you can control this as you want. It's just a little bit more fun, a little bit more to work with. As it is, I don't normally use post-processing on these because it's a bit too much, but I do set the material to have an exponent value of about 1.3. Let's do 1.2. And now we have a look at our widget. So our light switch is the wrong one. There it is. We can then see how it's different. So we can actually match these up to be more accurate in game. So 1.1 looks about right. Make compile and save. And that's going to be it for our buttons. So let's make a new folder in here called UMG materials. Keep everything together. And I've only just realized that actually that widget off button is not capitalized. Not save. So now it looks much better. So that's it for this video. In the next one, we will probably look at doing a VR watch of some kind, which maybe tells a time or it has a timer built into it. And then we'll have a look at some other stuff as well if it comes up. But for now, I want to say a big thank you to all my patrons for making this video possible. And if you do want to get access to these files so you can jump in and have a play around with all of this yourself, then make sure to head over there. There'll be a link in the description to do so. While you're at it, feel free to drop by the Discord if you have any questions or if you need any help with anything. As in there most days, and you'll be able to just ping me a message and we'll see what we can do. So until next time, stay safe and I'll see you then. Bye.